Thank you everyone for joining us. As Philippa said, I'm an ethicist. I largely work on the ethics of socio-technical systems and have been doing so for almost 15 years. My history in this space is a little non-traditional in that I became interested in philosophy through building an AI startup when I was very young, about 19 years old, going out into the world naively and ambitiously, making lots of mistakes and feeling significant discomfort with many of the dynamics that I was interacting with for the first time. And little did I know at the time that would enliven my interest in all of these different diverse modes of philosophical inquiry and praxis or practice. And I'm really grateful to be here today, to be, as Philippa said, attempting to bring together a number of the previous topics that we've been so fortunate to discuss with some brilliant scholars and practitioners around the world. It's a weird and crazy and maybe in some ways wonderful time to be alive, between worlds, as it's sometimes referred to. So I'm hoping that what we cover today is interesting, uh, insightful, potentially, and maybe in some cases even actionable for those of you who are trying to figure out what does it mean to live well uh, in this time when it feels like so many of us are banging our head against a brick wall half the day. I'll start with that, and I'll just as we always do, I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples here in Naarm in Melbourne, and following up what Philippa said, just want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And so yeah, I'm really grateful, Philippa, that we always start that way. And thank you everyone for affording us that opportunity to kick off. With that spirit of sort of connection to past, present, and emerging.
Thank you so much, Nate. That was beautifully put. Let's kick off, I think, with some basics, which we did attempt to do last time. But for those of you who weren't able to join us, I asked you, what do we mean by arms race? Because we've called this event AI and the Arms Race. So can you just give us a primer on what we mean by that term?
Yeah, so an arms race is technically an expression of a multipolar trap. And very simply, this is a situation where seemingly, rational choices by individuals or groups add up to ridiculously irrational and destructive outcomes for everyone. So the classic example, of course, is racing to build a larger and more powerful military arsenal, or particular type of weaponry. And of course, during World War II, that was very much shared reality, in order to win the game. And it's typically done under the guise of, we're going to get there first and we're the virtuous ones. And as a result of getting there first, we will assure that no one else gets there, and that will bring about peace and prosperity. And these are the narratives that are often espoused in such contexts. And the AI arms race is somewhat similar. Some of the actors might think they're racing to the top. I'm not sure what the top means in this context. Many critical commentators will suggest it's something like a race to the bottom. But what we're seeing here are, uh, on the whole, terribly perverse actions, um, profound investment in the infrastructure needed for what we call AI. Whether that's even a particularly useful naming convention is a different story. Through the form of, the material supply chains, the energy and water demands, et cetera, that give rise to data center infrastructure. I've seen trillions of dollars spent on this Um, and everyone's trying to get there first, wherever there actually is. And it seems probably to these actors again that there is some sort of rational process that they're executing. They're probably telling themselves a story about their, their virtuosity, and that this is going to be amazing for everyone in some way, shape, or form. I don't know, maybe the power that they established through this process will quote unquote trickle down to everyone else. That's a pun, for everyone who knows the myth of trickle down economics. Um, so yeah, the AI arms race is really just a particular modern expression of the dynamics of an arms race. An arms race itself is just an expression of a multipolar trap where individuals or groups, maximize their utility tokens at the expense of the whole. And throughout history, we've seen so many instances of this where, and it's a form of collective coordination failure. Um, and what's really, I suppose, because if you actually look at this, you really look at this deeply, like it's tragic, tragedy of the commons type of thing. Um, but it doesn't have to be this way. And I'm hopeful that even if we go in and towards a lot of the difficulty tonight, Philippa, which I think we have the opportunity to and the affordance to, we're not going to leave feeling utterly woeful. I actually think that we might go in through and beyond some of that difficulty, from the tragic to the pre-tragic, excuse me, to the tragic to the post-tragic. That's my aim, anyways. Let's see if we actually get there. You never know. These things are very generative, pun intended, and emergent, and therefore unknowable.
Yeah, no, that I'm hopeful we'll also end on a positive note. But before we do, let's take us a little bit deeper and let's talk a little bit more about those perverse incentives and how they influence these dynamics, because we've talked about this kind of previously throughout the series, but it would be good if you could just kind of go over, all of the factors that are influencing this multipolar trap as you described.
Well, to go over all of them might be a little challenging, but I think we can perhaps allude to some of the problematic dynamics that I think we're all going to be somewhat familiar with to some greater or lesser extent, even if we're not sort of studying them in some formal scholarly way. So, I mean, one of the things that we probably have to reference is the nature of the kind of like socio-political economic paradigm that we find ourselves in. And, there are some commentators that suggest we're no longer even in a sort of capitalistic paradigm per se, but rather a techno-feudalistic paradigm. I, I, I'm not entirely certain about that. I think it's probably, we have some of those techno-feudalistic characteristics. We have some sort of quote unquote late stage capitalistic characteristics. Um, and we have a particular expression of that, right? I think if Adam Smith or one of those early and very influential commentators was here, they probably wouldn't quite recognize the dynamics, at least in the way that they had envisaged them. That's not to suggest that they envisaged these dynamics in some entirely perfect and unquestionable way. But, so the paradigm, the broader paradigm within which we're building these increasingly powerful, but of course problematic socio-technical systems, um, are such that winner-take-all type dynamics, um, perverse incentives, externalizing harm, et cetera, like it's kind of commonplace. And so just in some thought experiment, if you imagine a fundamentally different socio-political economic sort of paradigm, the very same systems might perform and be used very differently. I mean, because, then the training data would be different, the processes of acquiring the data, it would be fundamentally different. But that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We can't assess the nature and function of these systems, the role that they have played, are playing, and might play in our world going forward outside of that context. So I think that that's really important. And I often describe the the other thing, I referred to the fact that artificial intelligence might not be a particularly useful naming convention. And, this name was selected in the mid 50s. Uh, and often folks think that the sort of work on AI formally kicked off in the mid 50s, but particularly at Dartmouth. It's not entirely true. The work, really kicked off in wartime 1940, started with cybernetics, and it kind of branched out from there in different ways based on different perspectives, disagreements, biases, conflict, all this different type of typically human stuff, right? Um, but this naming convention, artificial intelligence, is like a particularly interesting one. And it's unclear whether these systems have anything like what we tend to think of as intelligence, recognizing that we don't have a generally agreed definition of intelligence yet. The divide between sort of artificial and life perhaps isn't as clear as folks often think it is. So there's lots of problems there. And then we get into sort of language and what's sometimes referred to as strategic polysemy. There was a really great paper from University of Durham researchers on this recently. They refer to this term gloss lighting, which is obviously drawing from the more well-recognized term gaslighting, where firms are using language in particular ways ultimately to not just avoid accountability, but actually design sort of opaqueness and Mysterianism into these systems. And that affords them certain privileges that if they used very specific, technically accurate language, they probably wouldn't be afforded. And so there's those kind of games that are being played. There's the fact that, one thing that I'm interested in, and I'm not it's not like I'm a private equity investor or anything like that, but when you look at the fundamentals of these businesses, they have the worst unit economics out of any businesses we've ever seen. And there's been some great analysis on this. And there's now a class action lawsuit against Microsoft for, amongst other things, failing to disclose billions and billions of dollars that they spent on their AI infrastructure, which might well be an expression of institutional investors getting a little edgy or antsy about the significant capital investments with no foreseeable pathway towards recuperating these investments. So what game are they actually playing here? If it's not a traditional sort of, hey, invest early and aggressively in order to capture market share and then, realize that payback over time, those numbers just don't seem to stack up. And everything that I referenced tonight, I'll provide references for. I think that's really important. I'm not going to be able to do it in real time, but I'll in the show notes, I'll make sure I provide Philippa with all of that. So there's those sort of things going on that are deeply problematic. In the background, there's also the ideologies of effective accelerationism, dark enlightenment, and techno-optimism, to name a few. There has been some really good quality literature recently on the pro-extinctionism movement within Silicon Valley. And yes, I'll say that again, on the pro-extinctionism movement in Silicon Valley. Again, I will provide references. There's a bunch of really great essays that have been written. There was one published in Aeon recently that really got into the weeds of effective accelerationism, and another on Substack that was 18,500 words published by a critical AI scholar whose work I think is very high quality on the pro-extinctionist movement. And I think it was titled something like "One Half a Pro-Human Manifesto" or something like this, in response to that. So there's really odd ideological dynamics. occurring there that are having a significant effect on the way that the sort of quote unquote AI market is playing out. That's not to say that everyone involved in these big tech companies or AI labs ascribes to these belief systems. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. But there are some very powerful, influential public, weirdly, it's not like they're even hiding away, public examples of this. I mean, and then this whole series has been about the sort of biophysical incompatibility, Philippa, of what we're doing here. I mean, the UN just published a report about a week and a half ago suggesting that by 2030, hyperscale data centers could use as much water as 1.3 billion people. I mean, if you understand the way that hydrogen cycles work, now let's just say it's even 50% off, right? Which would be a huge margin of error. That's still crazy. Like 650 million people for real. Um, so there's probably like indefensibility in what we're doing just based on the kind of like seeming at present biophysical incompatibility of what is occurring. There has been some great scholarship, and we had Sophia Falk as our first guest, who is doing the wonderful work of taking NVIDIA chips, burning them in a lab to analyze their elemental composition, because there is such a lack of transparency from uh, all of the organizations involved in the material supply chains of AI. If you're interested in what these supply chains look like, you may recall the work from Crawford et al. Back in 2018, Anatomy of an AI System. There was an equivalent of that published, I think, last year, titled The Cartography of Generative AI, which is a really impressive visualization of the materiality of AI, a generative AI, which is very computationally intensive. Like we used to think that the cost, the environmental cost of training these models was problematic, and then we realized pretty quickly that it's actually the cost of inference, that the ongoing computation that is really significant, and that's before we get to what is referred to as agentic AI. One of the papers that I'll provide is a critique, what's called the critique of the agent model, or critique of agent model. These things don't have agency in the way that we think about agency biologically or organismically. Don't say that one too fast or skip a couple of letters, otherwise you might get in trouble. So, I mean, like those are just a few of the things, right? And then you've got the traditional stuff, like you've got the FOMO dynamics, because everyone's being told that, like, oh my God, like if you don't jump on the bandwagon, you're going to get left behind. Don't be a laggard, bro. And it's typically concluded with bro at the end. But the literature on this is not particularly compelling at all. Like one of the references that I'll provide comes from UC Berkeley, and they basically suggest that the meta-analytical evidence to date, right, to date, does not suggest there is a positive relationship between AI adoption and overall productivity gains at all. Because one of the things that we tend to see, even if there is got to remember, measuring productivity is hard, right? So even if you take just a particular functional workflow, human writing versus next token prediction, and you go, oh, we're just going to time it. Well, of course, that process is going to be faster, right? Because it's a fundamentally different process. And you go see productivity gain, but that's not an accurate determinant of productivity. What you have to add are two other more complex dimensions. You have to add a qualitative assessment, right? And what we tend to see in the literature, and again, I can provide some stuff on this if it's helpful, Philippa. What we tend to see when we add the qualitative dimension is most of the productivity gains get eroded, often as a result of what's referred to as AI work slop. But there is a even further or more complex dimension, and that's that we need to internalize the externality. So you may have heard that the process of cognitively offloading work effort to a generative AI system can over time result in cognitive atrophy and other issues. So there's a whole area of literature on the mutually reinforcing psychological harms of generative AI usage. Things like the LLM fallacy, etc. There's a bunch of stuff there. And so cognitive atrophy and foreclosure are two particular issues that we're looking at. But if we refer to that as sort of skill, knowledge, skill, ability, etc., that's the third dimension. In order to get a reliable productivity measure, we have to add the qualitative assessment and we have to internalize the externalities. Now, if you do the qualitative assessment and you get comparable or better quality using AI, and you're able to somehow effectively treat or mitigate the risk of skills atrophy, etc., or negative effect on knowledge, skill retention, skill acquisition, ability, etc., remembering that these things are often systemic in nature rather than just acutely related to the specific tasks. But I'm not even going to introduce that complexity right now. And that's also okay. Then you can say that generative AI produces productivity gains. If you can't prove those other two things, and you can't prove the three sort of determinants together, then so that's something. I've mentioned the mutually reinforcing psychological harms. It's not clear yet how we effectively mitigate those because, I mentioned the LLM fallacy. This is an interesting one. It's basically, it's a cognitive attribution error where individuals using generative AI systems basically start believing that the newfound abilities that they have through pairing, I'm using most of these terms in inverted commas, right? Pairing with this socio-technical system, with the generative AI system, and they start ascribing those abilities to themselves. And there's a bunch of other stuff, like we've seen, there was another paper published very recently that demonstrated that even if you are inexperienced and don't have much skill in a particular area, you're really experienced and have a lot of skill in a particular area, which is often where we see a significant difference in something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. People who don't have much skill or experience overassert their abilities. People who have lots of skill and experience kind of underassert their abilities. Both of these groups, when using generative AI, overassert their abilities. All right, so that's kind of like that LLM fallacy playing out. So there's so many things. Like I am keeping up with some of the literature as best as any one individual can because it's hugely relevant to my applied ethics work. But I can't possibly keep up. That's just a tip of the iceberg type summary of some of the things that I think are interesting, challenging, confronting, difficult. It's not to say it's the end of times, all that, but yeah, let's go to the next question.
Yeah, it's wow, there's so much that we could dive into there. I want to pick up on cognitive atrophy just because that's not something we've talked about previously in the other events. I think it's something that was spoken about in a separate RSA event, and it seems to be where all the attention is being driven at the moment. How will AI affect the way we think, the way we write, the way we educate and yeah, the skills we have, as you just mentioned. But can you tell us a little bit more about the reality of that cognitive atrophy and the risks?
Like we only have 3 years or so of empirical literature. And so, and this is not a unique to AI thing, right? This is just anytime we offload something that we previously did more effortfully to some other process, we're going to see atrophy in that area. Like that's totally expected. And the classic example I use, so let's say I go to the gym for 10 years and I'm obsessed and I get in amazing shape. I put on all this muscle, I'm eating right, I'm sleeping well. I'm not stressing too much. It's like, yeah. And then I stop going to the gym. What happens? Classic, you don't use it. You don't use it, you lose it. It's very similar. And of course, there are various different ways in which the scholars studying this are attempting to describe like causally what's going on, and there's some really wonderful literature on this. That's basically it. And so, I mean, a lot of people are then saying, but it's not that big of a deal. Like, all we're going to do is offload the tasks that we don't want to do, and then we're going to have more time to do the ones that we do. I think that that can become, I'm not real big on slippery slope arguments necessarily, um, unless they're, they're well thought out. And the slippery slope, you have sort of like complex causality type explanation of what that slippery slope is, but it becomes a little bit like of an infinite regress in some ways. So you offload this, and oh, that's great, and then you offload that, and this is what we're actually seeing. I think people offload more and more to these tools, but then they're told, well, yeah, but well, you can't, these are probabilistic systems. So if you have to rely on the output, you have to verify it. Verification is not optional. You have to verify. And people are like, yeah, but it's good enough. So, and then they stop verifying it, so there's this kind of process that occurs there. And the way it looks, I said there's, this mutual reinforcement. So most people like using these systems, Philippa, like, right, I'm not having to go at them. Like, they're stuck in a world where they're told that if you're not productive, you don't matter, right? I mean, we're not going to even get into the problems of this, this very instrumentalized sort of society, or maybe we will, I don't know, but let's avoid that for now. And so people are like, all right, well, like I want to do the things that I really am inspired to do, and like that's totally like okay to want to do that. And oh, but I'm really, I want to, or I want to be more productive, or I don't know, cost of living's rising so much, so you need a side hustle, or I don't know, whatever all of these dynamics are, right? Like, people aren't going, I want to lose my capacity for complex problem solving over the next 10 years. Like, no one's starting out with that intention. That's ridiculous, right? Um, so it sort of starts off with, I think, in many cases, like really well intended, if at times somewhat poorly informed, right? And part of being poorly informed, this is not an attack on individuals using these systems. It's like the marketing rhetoric and stuff like that, right? Like, I was listening into a big tech vendor present something a few weeks ago, and in the first 10 minutes, there were 7 false or misleading claims that I had noted. I'm not going to say who it was, but like, so they don't have a great track record of describing with technical accuracy. And this is not to say that all the tech companies or all the AI labs are kind of equivalent. I think some of them do a better job than others, and there's a little bit of a spread there. But so again, I'm not having a crack at individuals. I get why these things are attractive in the paradigm that we're all part of, and that everyone is trying to sort of, in some way, shape, or form, win at, right? So it starts off as this well-intended process of cognitive offloading. But the problem is these systems are also designed to hack our attachment and like capture our attention through very deliberate means. And over time, this process can lead to what you can think of as like intellectual impairment. And in other ways, scholars are studying personality disorders, loss of self-awareness, et cetera, the phenomenology of generative AI-induced psychosis. There's many different processes that are playing out that are problematic and that deserve attention. And we had Matt Mitka on, and he was talking about his very unique research in human AI coupling and measuring nervous system dynamics through that process. That's an area of AI safety, as Matt discussed, that's totally under indexed. Like, no one that I'm seeing is doing good work there. None of the AI labs are doing work on the effect that these systems have on the nervous system, let alone our psychology, our sense of self, our identity, our sense of belonging, our worldview, our ontology, epistemology, etc., our values. And these systems are affecting all of it. So I mean, you can think about it very simply as like, if you don't use it, you lose it. And like I said, I'll provide references and resources to Philippa in the show notes, so you've got lots of reading ahead of you if you're interested.
Amazing. I think that takes us really nicely to the lack of guardrails, lack of boundaries that we've talked about previously on the series, and that you've just alluded to there as well. And I want to bring in Eric's comment where he said that, it's important to realize that when we're talking about an AI arms race, what we're discussing supersedes national boundaries. And I want to talk about that element and the, as I said, the lack of, you know, controls, legislative controls, ethical boundaries, just lack of parameters that we've referenced previously. And Eric, if there's anything you want to actually bring in that question as well,
Yeah,
please.
Nate, I felt like I was just sitting in a McKinsey 3-day symposium, so thank you for that. Um, I just pulling back to one of the things you said earlier. What is actionable, in terms of this viewer audience? I think, one of the things we as attendees and members of society have to really lean in and understand what the technology is, because I think there's a lot of fear out there, and I think it's a lot of fear being used to drive certain agendas because people don't necessarily understand. And I think, your point about multipolar trap is spot on, because we see this evolution of multipolar traps through the rise of social media and very dogmatic approaches that are instilling fear and compelling people to move in a direction maybe they don't even know they're moving into. So thank you for raising that. And I think, for a modern AI platform to have scale, nobody's making money. Let's be clear. Anthropic, Perplexity, nobody's making money, but they're trying to build scale with this multinational footprint in order to someday promise their investors that they're going to become a profitable consortium, which I'm highly skeptical of. All along the way, damaging the environment. You hear about these data centers and the sustainability, and it's just a mess. But I think because it's a fast-moving technology that the governments and the politicians aren't really equipped to process, they're just getting pulled in a lot of different directions.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
they're
yeah. Final plug. If you have not read the encyclical letter published by the Pope in May, please do so, because it's a 60-page read. Okay, so and I'll put my hand up. I cheated, right? And I ran the encyclical through my own LLM for a 2-page executive summary, but he broke it down into 3 areas: human performance being managed by these agentic AI systems. Okay, so the dehumanizing or the break between management and employees, but also the relationship of the human nature to these LLMs, because it does have a memory. Kind of touching on what you said about cognitive atrophy, it's also replacing this human relationship with a machine. So I think that's something we should pay particular attention to as well.
Yeah, all really great points, Eric. I think that, it
The
brings
earlier
up,
point about the nations, the rise of this supranational
mm.
AI platform over a national identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think Scott, some scholars would argue that we've been in sort of like a paradigm of corporatism for quite a while, right? In which corporations basically have more power than governments. Now, in a military sense, that's not necessarily true, but in other senses, that probably is an accurate depiction of where we've been for quite a while. But this is sort of that on steroids, and it is an incredibly challenging situation to find ourselves within. Um, I mean, one of the things that I remember in the description, the very short description of this, like the Eventbrite description for this episode, uh, was referring to, I think, Philippa, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of Daniel Schmachtenberger's work from Civilizational Research Institute. And I think what he refers to as restraint wisdom. I think there's an interesting segue that I'd like to make here, Eric, in that, I mean, I sort of referenced very early in the opening that, or did I? Maybe I could be imagining this. I could be hallucinating. Um, anyways, whether I said it or not, I'll say it now. We think this is very royal. This is directed at all of us, recognizing we all have some role to play in this complex worlding process, different roles to play in this complex worlding process. Like everything that we're doing is like there's no inevitability here. There is no AI inevitable future. I mean, it gets posited that way a lot. And there's a great paper I'll share that was published in 2023 on this. That sort of philosophically unpacks that AI inevitability position. One of the interesting things about wisdom, and it's obviously philosophers have been talking about wisdom for a long time. Psychologists have been attempting to sort of study and categorize the characteristics of and even measure wisdom. I mean, philosophers tend to have a giggle at that a lot of the time, but there's different takes on this. Again, I can provide there's two good resources on this that might be of interest to you if you enjoy that topic. One sort of overview just from Psychology Today that's really great on the way that psychological scientists look at this, and another from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that kind of gets into the different ways in which philosophers have talked about wisdom over the years. It seems to be some kind of asymptotic process. It's not like you arrive somewhere. There's no destination. And it's something like a conversation with reality. It's not necessarily something that you have alone. It's kind of like an ecological phenomena of sorts. But one of the things that does seem prominent in most depictions of wisdom, recognizing their maps of more complex territories, is the idea of restraint. And I mean, I'm an ethicist, right? And ethics fundamentally is the process of justifying the best reasons for action. It's the process that we execute to decide not what can be done, but what ought to be done because it's good and right. And that really means stepping back, taking stock and going like, all right, where have we come from? Like, how did we get here? Where are we now? What is it that truly matters? What are the values that we hold near and dear? What do we want to strive for, fight for, seek to defend? And what type of world can we envisage? Like a lot of people forget that in applied ethics, like moral imagination is a really important part of the process. People often think it's this very mechanical kind of process. I don't believe it is at all, even if it has some more analytical like processes as part of the broader gestalt, if you will. And then acting in alignment with that direction that we believe we ought to pursue. And that necessarily means saying no to certain directions. That means applying restraint. And one of the things that we're seeing at the moment, and it's sometimes referred to as the AI refusal movement, and it's gaining steam. There's a lot of folks who are just outright refusing, like outright refusing. Now, I don't use, full disclosure, I don't use generative AI in any way, shape, or form, even though I have to spend a lot of time attempting to understand these systems and critically interrogate them and critically interrogate the governance architectures of these different systems, because it's part of my work, right? It's a really important part of my work. A lot of my colleagues use these systems. I don't. I made the decision in early 2023 based on a number of different grounds, but some of them were non-instrumental grounds. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about much today is that we're wrapped up in this instrumental paradigm. Everything is a means to some end. It's not clear what the end is. We are treated as means to an end. I mean, Kant would be horrified. And that's really problematic. And I think that there are non-instrumental reasons to potentially avoid, these systems. And one of the things that, again, and this is sort of like a risk that seems to be playing out, or was playing out rather, a risk becoming an issue, a risk being realized prior to late 2022, when many folks started gaining access to these systems publicly for the first time, was the sort of mechanization of, the human being, the human organism, the human process, or the human in the process of becoming. The paradigm that we found ourselves in is one that's almost encouraging us to be more machine-like. And that's antithetical to what technology really ought to be. Some meaningful, thoughtful, at times restrained augmentation of our abilities, something that deepens our relationship to one another and reality, something that enables us to more wisely steward our incredible power and prowess as a species, such that perhaps we can become something like, a custodial species of planet Earth. So, I mean, there's a few things there. I'll stop and let some other folks ask questions. But thank you, Eric. I really appreciate that, mate. Thank you.
Thank you. Shona, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Philippa. Nate, thank you. God, I mean, the amount of times I'm saying yes as I'm listening to you speak is quite something. And actually, I have to say, I was slightly nervous when I got on the call, thinking, "Gosh, I'm not quite sure what the nature of this call is." But when you started, I was very pleased that it was going where it was. And I think, yeah, I mean, there's too many things to talk about, really. But one of the things that we talk about it being parallel to an arms race, and you've spoken to that. And the other parallel that I notice is being drawn is it's following the same mechanism of drug dealers, sort of like filter the market, get us all hooked, and then shorten the supply and increase the costs. And it's sort of that brilliant model. To me, I also think it also follows a similar projection of where we've gone with fast food. That's wrecked our bodies, and I think we're going down that track with our minds. And I'm speaking for someone who's a performing artist, who our raison d'etre is human to human connection. And your comment about, and this is a line that I've parroted many times to people in this discussion, similar discussions and debate. Just because we can does not mean we should. But that sense of sort of this grounding of, we seem to have lost in all the noise that we sit amongst, and all the learning we have well before these bloody machines supposedly gave it to us. Just going to a library and opening a book. All this knowledge we have from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago by many, many very, very clever people telling us what we should do. We still, as humans, don't do it. I mean, your allusion to ethics, that it should direct us on the path that we know we should be going, but we seem to have lost that. And I know there's this rhetoric which gets wheeled out by people going, well, it's already there. It's the horse is bolted. We've just got to go with it. I'm like, bloody hell! Actually, you can still get a horse that's gone wild. If we all act together, actually, you can't do it with one person, but you get a group of people, you can still tame that horse. And it always strikes me the thing, and maybe this is being discussed, but I haven't come across it yet, is that, and you mentioned fear. There was a time not so long ago, all very much in our immediate memories, where politicians who seem to have no spines whatsoever at the moment and are totally sort of bent over taking whatever they can get from the tech bros for some sort of God knows what reason. When there was a threat of actual physical death due to COVID, we were told to sit at home, we were told to wash our hands, and we were told to put our masks on, and we all did it while they got the virus under control. And worked out how we were going to deal with it as society. So that, it feels to me, this, pardon my French, but the bollocks spoken of, oh, well, it's already out there, we've got to go with it. And we've got no basis of we knowing where it's going. And it's probably, the evidence says it's pretty shit, but we've got to keep going now. And the fear, and it seems to me that unless politicians actually feel that they will be actually die themselves, the idea of environmental collapse and societal collapse and structural collapse, whatever structural collapse that may be, they can't seem to sort of get a handle on that. But they are able, when the fear directs to them personally, they take action very quickly, and we're all told what to do. And I just wonder why there is no direction between either individual governments or global organizations, why we are in the situation we're in now, and what your thoughts are on that, and indeed what we as all the little people can do.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that you've covered there, Shona, that's worthy of real time, attention, and consideration. Perhaps I can speak rather than directly to the questions themselves, to something that I think relates to all of the questions that might help bring it together. So you've probably heard the saying, wounded people wound. And I mean, this is particularly pertinent to me. My partner and I run an organization that bridges somatic and movement therapy, which is her work, and my work as a philosophical counselor, to support people in going towards the difficulties of their past and growing from their wounds, repatterning their nervous system and orienting towards their highest possibility. And I think that like there's a reason that we're so motivated to do that, and it's that the nervous system patterns of almost all of us are the result of, again, complex causal processes over millennia, right? And I think one way to think about this is none of us get away from life without being wounded. There's no such thing. And none of us at any stage in life are free of different forms of conditioning. They could be inherited beliefs, an inherited worldview, nervous system patterns that were established very early in life in an attempt to sort of protect us without any conscious awareness from us. This is an adaptive, intelligent, organismic process that for us as social species are particularly unique, and species that are capable of abstraction and abstract thought particularly unique. I think that so much of what's going on relates to that process of kind of like wounding through generations, conditioning through generations. And actually, as a result of that, we have very limited agency. Like if your nervous system is incredibly conditioned, you have very limited agency. You become identified with particular fear-based thought processes, you become identified with particular bodily phenomena. And I think that everyone is going through this to some greater or lesser extent in some way, shape, or form. I think addiction is a process that plays out in a very similar way. It's a habitual attempt to escape from pain, and it just so happens to have these, these neurophysiological and neurochemical processes that make that particularly sort of easy to get locked into and difficult to get out of for a lot of folks. So look, I don't think there's any way I can do justice to every single question that you've asked, excuse me, in one coherent answer. But I really do think that this, unless we can sort of grow from the wounds of our past, unless we can become less or differently conditioned, unless we can start stepping into what perhaps for many of us might be agency for the first time in our lives, this freedom to act based on our capacity for collective moral imagination will be terribly hindered. And then the last thing I'll say there is, that process, whatever that process looks like, and it will be slightly different for everyone, is of course a communal endeavor to some greater or lesser extent. And I mean, there's a Margaret Mead quote that many of you are probably familiar with that, I mean, I don't think it gets overused. I think it probably gets underused because it's so powerful. And it says, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And so I don't know, I'm not prescribing some sort of normative, like you have to do this, this is what you ought to do. But I think, each of us in our own ways with the people who we love, care for, and trust need to find ways to grow from our wounds, overcome our conditioning, and orient to some type of higher purpose and overcome these collective coordination failures. Start actually working together. In some ways, for those in certain positions, us overcoming those collective coordination failures are probably the scariest thing there is, and And so, yeah, I would encourage anyone that's interested in how they might participate from this day going forward to try and figure out what is it that you imagine is possible? Who can you work with to help make that more likely? And what is it that you need to do on a daily basis for yourself and for those that are participating in that process with you to make that increasingly likely as we move forward through time?
No, thank you for that. I mean, I agree absolutely. Actually, there seems to be, I think, one of the distorting factors of the time is that due to, well, the way they've, society's evolved and globalization and then social media and the fact that we can fly wherever, we sort of look at the world as such a big place, it's, and, I think there's the old thing of, you can't eat an elephant all at once, you have to start. Or I think that's right. I think I'm saying that right. But small chunks. There was a more beautiful analogy though I came across the other day, which was that when you look at the murmurings of swallows, which is the beautiful sort of connection a massive group of swallows makes, and scientists had studied for a long time trying to work out how did they know what was going on, and it thought it was sort of telepathic communication and all that sort of stuff, being really clever amongst this massive group. But actually, what a mathematician realized that it was literally each swallow was monitoring the swallows immediately around them, and then everyone around that was doing it, and that is what created this magnificent collective movement. And I think that leaning in as well, I mean, I think God, we too many examples have looked to nature because they get it right. I think that thing of hugging those closest and working with those around us is absolutely the way to go. And I think that's really, really important. I think possibly now more than, I think we always feel that we're in a worse case than anyone has been before us. But I think when you look at the environmental and the nuclear and threats on top of the crumbling of the norms that we are all sort of exist within, I think that makes our challenge even harder perhaps than it's ever been before, and more intimidating and paralyzing. But I'm with you 100%. All the little bits we can do add up to make a big difference.
Totally. And it's like, we need to find ways to coordinate across scales. There does need to be intergovernmental, etc. cooperation. We need to see that, and it needs to work in a way that it's never worked before. But most of us grounding in the everyday, in a committed sense of community, like that's where a huge amount of those conditional changes occur that can give rise to sort of new emergent possibilities. I mean, some people will participate in the intergovernmental, but most of us won't.
Of course. Absolutely.
And that's totally okay. I mean, there's another, you may be familiar with the poet David White, and my partner and I often joke about, he's got a poem about sort of taking the next courageous step, and it's sort of we use it all the time. Sort of, it's become a bit of an inside joke, and it says, start close in, don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing, close in, the step you don't want to take. And courage is, if you've ever read Nicomachean Ethics or any of Aristotle's philosophy, I would argue that virtue is one of the most important philosophical contributions of all time, and it is perhaps more relevant than it ever has been before. And I'm particularly fond of the virtue of courage. And we need to cultivate it more desperately, more urgently, and perhaps at a scale that is entirely unprecedented, now more than ever before.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you, Shona. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Shona. It's such a beautiful point to leave us on today. But Nate, is there anything else that you would like to share before we end this incredible series and this incredible journey that we've all been on over the last 7 events, sorry.
Yeah, look, very briefly, a simple taxonomy. So I'm going to start with optimism. Optimism is the belief that things will be better. Pessimism is the belief things will be worse. Hope is belief in the possibility of better. Active hope is living your life based on your belief in the possibility of better. Better is always possible. Authentic, meaningful progress is always possible. And I would encourage, and I use that very deliberately, encourage all of you to consider how you can live more actively, hopefully, than ever before, because we do face incredible interconnected systemic challenges right now, and they're scary, and that's going to require us to go toward and grieve for futures lost, grieve for the pain and suffering of the world, but then reorient again to active hope and act based on that active hope again and again and again and again. And going back to Margaret Mead, that is the type of thing that has the potential to fundamentally change the trajectory that we're on. And maybe we'll look back towards the end of our lives and be really proud of what we've contributed to.